All right, today we're diving into a really interesting idea that tries to connect some big dots, things like morality, physics, and even economics, all through a lens the source material calls the economy of karma. So let's just jump right in with a pretty wild question. I want you to forget about spreadsheets and stock prices for a second. What if economics wasn't just about human behavior? What if it was governed by a law as deep and as fundamental as something like gravity? Well, according to this perspective, that universal law is karma. And we're not just talking about the simple what goes around comes around idea. It's much bigger. It's the concept that no action, none, ever just ends by itself. Instead, our actions create these incredible chains of consequences that ripple out, not just for a day or a week, but across generations. Okay, so karma and economics. How in the world do those two things connect? Well, this is where it gets really interesting because the source material builds this fascinating bridge between physics, our moral actions, and the economy itself. Think about it like this. You've probably heard of the first law of thermodynamics in physics, right? It says energy can't be created or destroyed, it only changes form. Well, the argument here is that karma is kind of like the moral version of that law. The consequences of our actions, they don't just disappear. They just transform, changing shape and continuing to ripple outward. So if you follow that logic, you end up with this one core idea that the entire universe, from physical energy to moral actions, is built on a single fundamental rule, and that rule is transformation. Everything is always changing, always in a state of exchange. All right, if transformation is the law of the universe, then what happens when you try to fight it? What happens when you try to stop the flow? Let's see how this idea plays out in economics when we look at what's called a closed system. And that brings us right to the idea of protectionism. But when you look at it through this karma lens, it's not just about trade barriers or tariffs anymore. It's seen as a country literally trying to cut itself off from that universal cycle of transformation and exchange we were just talking about. So what's the result when you try to fight a law of the universe? Well, this quote really paints a picture, doesn't it? The idea is that a country doesn't actually protect itself. Instead, it walls itself in, suffocating under its own fear. It essentially cuts off its own oxygen supply, and everything just stagnates. Okay, that sounds pretty bleak. So if a closed system leads to suffocation, what's the flip side? Let's talk about the power of an open system and what this framework says are the real catalysts for growth. I mean, it's a fair question, right? If a closed economy is basically running out of air, where does it get the fresh energy it needs? Where does the fuel for all that essential transformation and growth actually come from? And this is where the source material gets very specific. It points to asylum seekers as being essential catalysts. In this model, they aren't viewed as a cost, but as a critical source of new energy. The argument is that they bring these intangible things like resilience and hope, but also really tangible things like new ideas and new labor, injecting a new vitality into the whole system. So, within this framework, the very act of people moving and seeking a new start isn't just a political issue. It's seen as living proof of that universal law we talked about at the beginning. It's evidence that transformation is not only constant, but absolutely essential for a healthy, growing society. All right, let's bring this all home. We've talked about this universal law of transformation, we've seen what happens in a closed system, and we've talked about catalysts. Now, let's look at why, from this perspective, being open isn't just a good idea, it's a fundamental demand. And to really make this point, the source uses a metaphor that I think we can all relate to, whether it's our social circles or our countries. It's simple. We all live in bubbles. But here's the catch. Those bubbles aren't self-sustaining. They need something from the outside to survive. They need what the source calls the oxygen of exchange. New people, fresh ideas, different energy. Without that flow from the outside, they get brittle, and eventually they have to burst. And all of this thinking, from physics to morality to economics, it all boils down to this one very forceful conclusion. It's not a suggestion, it's presented as a law. The economy of karma demands openness. And that leaves us with a final, really powerful question to think about. If the entire universe, on a fundamental level, only thrives because of transformation and exchange, well, the argument is that our societies must too. So the question we're left with is this. If that's the rule of the game, what exactly are we so afraid of?